Well, as we began this week, I said that the teachings that Solomon is giving to his son in these passages, beginning in verse 15 of chapter 5, are extremely practical things. And the first thing we talked about for the last few days was the practicality of marrying and staying married to the same person. Basically, this lifelong commitment that is allowed to become everything that God intended it to be. You know, that my wife and I didn't expect to live this long, much less to be married this long. But here we are, just a few weeks away from our 55th anniversary. And you look back on it, I know there were many junctures. They're kind of like times where we came to really crossroads and we had to make a decision. Are we going to continue to be committed to each other until death do his part? And, you know, it's the whole idea that you don't always find the other person enjoyable. In fact, especially when you get sideways with each other and you have conflicts and disagreements and you have to work through what are going to be the prevailing values that your family is going to be defined by. Those are critical moments for most people. And one of the issues where couples really get divided over, and probably it's considered by some to be the number one issue, is the issue of money. And we find that many couples go through, I think all couples go through seasons where there just simply isn't enough money to do everything that you want to do. And when there's not enough money, you have to make a decision. What are we going to do? Are we going to deny ourselves certain things? We're going to remove certain things from our expense account? Or are we just simply going to go into debt in order to continue to live at the lifestyle that we feel most comfortable with? My wife and I learned that debt was something that we couldn't handle. We learned this really early. And I got one credit card because I wanted to have a credit history. And the next thing I knew is I was indebted to this company for many months. And we were already living on a tight budget. And my father, fortunately, sat me down and said, don't ever do this again. He paid the debt off. And he said, from now on, only pay for what you can afford. Don't trust in credit cards. And, you know, I was newly married and a young man. I was so thankful for that lesson and instruction because my parents, growing up through the World War I, through the Depression, World War II, they didn't understand this fascination with credit card debt that really got going in my generation and now has pretty much taken over whole generations of young people. Especially we talk about student debt, where students have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. I had one therapist that I was physical therapist was working with me one time who had a doctorate degree in physical therapy, and he says, I will never make enough money to ever pay off my student loans. He says, I'll have my student loans the rest of my life. I'll be paying on them for the rest of my life because I do not make enough at my profession in order to pay down the debts that I had to take out in order to get my license. Now, I have to sit back and question, how wise was that? Maybe you could have found a cheaper school. I don't know. But one of the things that Solomon begins by saying here in chapter 6, he says, my son, if you have put up security for your neighbor, which is a form of indebtedness, if you have struck hands in a pledge for another, if you have been trapped by what you said or ensnared by the words of your mouth, then do this, my son, to free yourself, since you have fallen into your neighbor's hands. Go and humble yourself. Press your plea with your neighbor. Allow no sleep to your eyes, no slumber to your eyelids. Free yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter, like a bird from the snare of a fowler. Now, he's covering really a broad spectrum of financial issues. And the first and very most important thing we need is he's saying to us essentially, avoid unnecessary economic entanglements. And that can be either co-signing a loan, or it can be taking a loan on your own, or any other adventure where you entrust money to somebody or they entrust money to you to invest. And there's an expectation that you're going to be the security for it, that I'm secured. And it's one of the things I think is a real trap is what we call unsecured debt. You see, credit card are unsecured debt usually. I mean, if you go to the department store and you buy something and then you can't pay for it, they don't want what you bought back. You can't take back the blender or the stove or the used clothing back to the store and say, forgive me, I can't pay for this, so you can have it back. It's yours now, and you're responsible. All they're going to hang on to is the money that you owe. In fact, the way it often works is you take out the debt, they sell you the product, they receive their cut, And then again, they transfer your debt. They sell your debt to somebody else. In fact, most mortgages are set up like that a bank will set up the loan, but they're not required to collect on it. They then take a bundle of those loans that they've made and they sell them to a third party, and the third party wants you to pay back. They don't want the house or the car or anything else. And so the whole point is, if you buy a car, there is a secure debt, unless, of course, you've gotten completely upside down. But at least you can have it repossessed. At least you can sell it and maybe recoup some of your investments. The same way with a home. But when you talk about everything else, there's very, very few things that you can return. And those are unsecured debt. And that's really what Solomon's saying is avoid unsecured debt. Now, I'm not one of these people saying it's wrong to have credit cards. What I am saying is it's not wise to have a credit card that you carry a balance on, because again, the interest rate is prohibitively high. But the whole point is, I use a credit card because it's convenient. I don't like to carry a lot of money when I travel overseas. It's easy to buy things and at the lowest exchange rate simply because I'm doing it through bank transactions. But the whole point is that I pay off my balances every month. And I realize, we know how much we put on our card and we know what we can afford to pay. And so we don't exceed that. And that keeps us from getting into the situation where suddenly we're all stressed out. And I've seen marriages again fall apart because there was so much debt. I remember a wife coming to me one time of a person who was a friend of mine, in fact, in a pastorate. And she just told me, she said, we're $500,000 in debt because of credit cards. And basically, he started living beyond his means, and then he would take out additional cards to pay off that card, and was playing this game of, taking out another card to pay off other debts until it had just risen and risen and risen to the point where it was no longer sustainable. They couldn't even provide for their basics any longer. And that's why he says, when you get into these kind of things, you are trapped. You're ensnared by what you've given yourself in, and you are no longer in control of your own fate and your own destiny, but you're now controlled by others. Now, I understand that in our world today, that there's some places where debt is kind of necessary. And that's again when I talk about secure debt. I don't think there's anything wrong in taking out a loan to buy a house, if the house is of more value than the loan that you've taken out on it. One of the dangers is that you can get into loans. In fact, during 2008, with the building collapse, what happened was people were getting into homes that they couldn't afford. And they didn't have to be able to show that they could afford it. In fact, they didn't have to put anything down. It was a no interest loan in the beginning. But then eventually, they found themselves unable to pay the debt. And the reason there was the whole collapse was they again had bundled all these loans together and sold them to third parties as investors. And that's why the large investors ended up losing a bunch of money, because it's amazing. All it took was 3% default rate amongst those loans for the entire house of cards to come collapsing. And that's how the housing market collapsed. And what happened? You had homes that had more debt owed on them than were to be found in the value of the home. And the banks didn't want to sell them because they didn't want to show the loss. And so it just became this crazy mess until finally the government came and bailed the banks out, gave them tons of money so that they could liquidate the profit at a loss or the housing at a loss, and therefore escape without going into default. I don't know if you follow any of that. Great movie, The Great Short. It's a good movie. It really does lay it all out in pretty good detail. But one of the things he says is, if you find yourself in that situation, then do everything you can to escape it. Now, what my wife and I found is that what debt we've had, like on a home and then on a car, as soon as we had paid the car off, we didn't go out and get a new car. What we did is we started taking that money that we've been putting down on our car, or paying the note on our car, and we started applying it to our mortgage. And so we were able to buy down our mortgage in 10 years. So a 30-year mortgage we paid off in 10 years, because every time we paid off some kind of indebtedness, we just applied the money to the house that we had. So eventually, and where we've been for years now, we don't have any debts. We don't own any money on cars. We don't own any money on houses. And what credit cards we use, we pay off as we get them. And there's such a freedom in that, because not only do you tend to build equity that that in the future you can use for emergencies or pass on to your children, but also you don't have that pressure every day of having a bill that you have to pay. And believe me, most of us have been there. We know how that squeezes us. And that also applies to things like being a co-signer for someone else. Most parents find themselves as a co-signer in a student loan. And I can speak from experience of having someone who just decided they weren't going to pay their student loan anymore. My wife and I spent about 10 years paying $500 a month to cover that loan because they didn't choose to do so. So you kind of learn from your own mistakes. I knew better at the time, but I got guilted into it. But anyway, he says, do whatever you can to get free because you'll regret it down the road. And when somebody says, can you co-sign a note for me? I would say, if you have the money that they don't pay that you can pay it off, well, that's your choice at that point. But if you don't, you're just going to find yourself, they're going to walk away from their debt, and that debt is going to be passed on to you. And you don't want their bankruptcy to become your bankruptcy. Hope that makes sense. Okay, we'll continue on one more tomorrow. What is the secret of being prosperous?